Today at the National Press Club, Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko, and from the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations, Kateryna Argyrou. 2 years after Russia's invasion, Vasyl Myroshnychenko and Kateryna Argyrou with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia for this Westpac address. I'm Uhlmann. We meet today in the grim shadow of the second anniversary of Russia's unprovoked attack against Ukraine. There's much to discuss, not least whether the will of the West will last in support of this war on the border between democracy and tyranny. We'll come to our speakers in just a moment, but first could I ask you all to be upstanding as we hear from the Canberra Ukrainian Community Choir. Quiet to clear the stage, but Ukraine has not yet perished, is what that anthem says. But it could. And if it does that matter to this small democracy 15,000 kilometres from the front line? Is this a war for a piece of land or something bigger? Is this the front line of a battle over who will set the rules for how the world is run in the 21st century? We have two guests today. The first will be well known to many as a powerful and passionate voice for his country, Ambassador of Ukraine, His Excellency Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Our second speaker has many roles. Her day job is as a portfolio manager for an Australian funds management firm, to which she brings honours degrees from George Washington University and the London School of Economics. Her 24-hour job is as the mother of one and very, in fact, disturbingly shortly, 2 children. In her spare time, she is, among other things, co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organisations. She's also part of a civilian supply chain that delivers equipment to the front lines. I went to those front lines last year in Ukraine, and on those front lines, Kateryna is a legend. So would you please also welcome Kateryna Argyrou. And I'll ask the Ambassador to begin.
President, members of the Press Club, senators, members of the Australian Parliament, fellow members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, supporters of Ukraine watching and listening in, ladies and gentlemen, let me add my sincere acknowledgement of the First Nations people. Separately, I would like to acknowledge Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles for coming here, Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham, Shadow Defence Minister Andrew Hastie, Senators Billig, Senator Reynolds, Senator Sharma. Sorry if I missed Senator David Fawcett. Sorry if I missed anybody. Happy to have my friends from the Diplomatic Corps, ambassadors from the UK, Croatia, Latvia. And sorry if I missed anybody. But it's an honor to once again accept the privilege of addressing the National Press Club. Joining me today is Kateryna Argyrou, co-chair of the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations, who will offer some insights on the essential work that she and others are undertaking here and in Ukraine. I intend to speak plainly today, so there is no doubt about my meaning. My experience of Australian journalists is that your questions at the end of my remarks will be even more pointed, so there is always something to look forward to. We're here to mark the second anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. Let's be honest. Russia, China, Europe, NATO, and the Five Eyes nations thought that Ukraine would be defeated in 3 weeks, maybe 5 if we were lucky. 2 years later, Ukraine is still fighting hard. But the question for today is, in this forum at the National Press Club, do you want to see this war drag on for another year? Another 2 years? Longer? Do you want Russia to win? Is that acceptable to you? In short, is there a limit that liberal democracies, including Australia, will place on Russia's unprovoked, illegal, immoral war of territorial annexation against Ukraine? Is there no limit? How does this war end, and when? Ladies and gentlemen, I'm a firm believer in optimistic leadership. Optimistic, realistic, determined, positive leadership is something we can all unite behind. All when it succeeds, it is magnificent to watch. I hope you will agree that President Zelensky embodies the characteristics of optimistic leadership. He has done a remarkable job of holding the country together and galvanizing a heroic defense of the nation when everyone around the world, including here in Australia, thought Ukraine would collapse. Australia has certainly responded to President Zelensky and to the desperate defense of Ukraine in a very meaningful and practical way. Ukraine's frontline troops and Ukraine's civilians clearly know exactly what Australia has given them. They're deeply grateful and will never forget Australia. The defense of Ukraine has bipartisan support in the Australian Parliament, and frankly speaking, Ukraine needs it. The Bushmasters, artillery, the lightweight drones, the cold delivery, and all other things make a dramatic difference. They save lives, they prevent casualties, they enable an effective defense. Australia's contributions, when combined with everyone else's, are vital. Everything helps, everything makes a difference. Nothing is wasted. But it is not enough assistance. It is not enough assistance to create the excess military firepower and combat force that we need to reverse Russian gains and to end the war. It is not enough assistance to give Ukraine's civilians sufficient defensive capabilities to resist Russian military missile and drone targeting. Ukraine's people are fighting hard, but they do not have enough military, humanitarian assistance, and reconstruction support to win, and thus to end this war. We have just enough assistance, barely enough assistance. We have drip-fed and ad hoc one-off support contributions sufficient to hang on and to keep on going. Yes, at this rate, we can slowly keep going. But is it acceptable? How many more years should this war drag on? We need more of everything. We need enough to end this war and defeat Russia's invasion. Hanging on is not enough. At the beginning of this invasion, I said, if Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. This is still true. But Russia thinks it can win and doesn't want to stop fighting. Ukraine has a right to its sovereignty, independence, self-defense, and national security, so we will not stop fighting. Ukraine has shown that it can defend itself. We have shown that Ukrainian soldiers can match and overmatch Russian military forces at sea and on land. We have shown we can effectively employ foreign military equipment and humanitarian support, perhaps more effectively than anyone expected, including the Russian Black Sea Fleet. We have shown that we do not squander your practical assistance. We have shown that we are optimistic and resilient in the face of an existential threat, not only for our nation, but also to the international rules-based order. Let us show you that we can do more if you provide us with more. This is a message to you, to the Five Eyes nations, to NATO members, to the EU. Let us show you that we can do more if you provide us with more. The fundamental issues are this. Ukraine is not asking Australia or anyone else to send combat troops to fight for us. We can fight for ourselves. But we cannot fight empty-handed. We need more, and so that we can do more. We want the war to end swiftly. We do not want year after year of Russia versus Ukraine meat grinder. Ukraine wants an end game, and we know that it is what liberal democracies want. The UN Charter to prevail, sovereign borders to be respected, no wars of territorial annexation, global security, stability, international agreements to be upheld, and global economy normalized. Ukraine wants its borders, its freedom, its sovereignty restored swiftly and irreversibly. So where does it leave Australia? What can Australia do? Optimistic, active leadership is priceless. We don't have to look hard to find it, and Australia is good at it. Australia can contribute more. Ukraine would like to see Australia play a direct and active role with other like-minded nations in the Tank Coalition, in the Air Power Coalition, and other coalitions that are forming around military capability supply and capacity building. These are optimistic initiatives delivering practical combat power that prepares Ukraine to end this war. Ukraine also needs air defense to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Australia can contribute more. Ukraine needs to be relieved as much as possible of the humanitarian burden to protect, nurture, and support the civilian community so that Ukraine can focus all internal efforts toward military objectives. Ukraine needs more humanitarian assistance, energy resources, especially coal, public utility repairs, and reconstruction support. We need it now. Ukraine needs to return to peacetime full functionality as fast as possible. Removing Russian landmines, rebuilding agricultural and industrial capacity, restoring energy reticulation and lines of communication, and repairing war damage are all lines of effort that Australian construction, commerce, and industry are very good at. We cannot wait for the war to end before commencing this war. Australia can contribute more. In this regard, Ukraine is deeply grateful for the continued vocal, practical, and precise support of Andrew and Nicola Forrest and their Mindera Foundation. They have demonstrated that supporting Ukraine's defense and reconstruction is a whole-of-community enterprise. There is a role for private sector industry, business, philanthropy, and not just for the government. The demining of agricultural land is just one of many areas where private sector can contribute. Ukraine needs an avalanche of international support. We need so much international support we can barely absorb it. We need push logistics, not pull logistics. The current model sees international assistance arriving in ad hoc packets that are barely enough and only just in time. Our artillery guns and mortars are falling silent for want of ammunition at the gun lines. We don't have enough missiles for our target list. We don't have enough helicopters to retrieve our frontline casualties and get them to combat surgical hospitals. We need the governments and defense industries of our friends and allies to shift into a high gear, overdrive. They need to shift from a calculated drawing down of surplus war stocks and move to a determined wartime production footing. Ammunition and missile production lines that remain at a low-rate production, working 38-hour, 4-day weeks is not where we need to be in 2024. We need a wartime ammunition, missile, armored vehicle, and drone assembly line tempo. We need high-rate production, we need high-throughput explosive and propellant supply chains, and we need them now. Australia has a role to play and can contribute more to the propellant and explosive supply chain effort. More than all of the things is the need for thought leadership. Australia is very good at this too. Ukraine needs innovative, creative, effective ways to generate a fast, slick military and humanitarian supply chain into Ukraine, a supply chain without bottlenecks. In World War II, America enthusiastically took the title of the Arsenal of Democracy. Ukraine needs Australia to remain a member of the enthusiastic network of liberal democracies that will become the arsenal of democracy for Ukraine. More can be done in 2024. Ukraine knows that it's a hugely expensive fight, and there are very high direct and opportunity costs carried by every nation that supports Ukraine against the unrestrained Russian invasion. But this is a fight that cannot be reduced to dollars and cents. Contributions to Ukraine's defense are not charitable donations. They are the investment in the defense of the international rules-based order, the primacy of the UN Charter, the entitlement of law-abiding nations to rely on its sovereignty and its sovereign borders, the freedom from armed aggression. It is a direct resistance to the cynical perversion of the UN Security Council by one of its permanent members. I was recently asked if Ukraine really was fighting on behalf of Australia. The answer is yes, yes it is. Every Ukrainian wants to have what every Australian has and what we used to have. Just like you, we want to take our kids bushwalking or camping over the weekend. But our countryside is deliberately and indiscriminately littered with unmarked Russian minefields now. Our farmers are just like your farmers. They want to get a fair price for the food and fiber they produce, and not to be concerned about unexploded ordnance or transport chains attacked by military forces, which in many cases have destroyed their businesses. Parents want to read a bedtime story to their kids, but instead rush to winter bomb shelters when the air raid sirens sound. Godparents want to babysit for their grandchildren instead of going to their funerals because Russians used a missile to deliberately strike a school. Our young lads want to go to football training and go out for beer on Friday night, but they have to be in the trenches under the Russian shelling. I have spent time at the Australian War Memorial. It is incredibly moving and thought-provoking. There are 103,000 names on the walls of the Roll of Honor. Those names gave their tomorrows so we can have our todays. Ukrainian women and men on the front line are giving up their tomorrows right now, too, for the same values and principles as those for which Australians died: sovereignty, democracy, and freedom from armed coercion. Ukraine will fight and die for those values and principles, but we cannot do it alone. We need Australia's help and that all of other like-minded nations. Much has been done so far, for which Ukrainians will be eternally grateful. Ukrainians realize that our lives will never be the same as they were before the 24th of February 2022. But we will do everything possible to make sure that the next generation lives in peace and security on its own land without having to die for the privilege. Ukrainians hope you will be able to help to a greater degree. We have already accepted the absolute requirement to set aside our desire for revenge. But we cannot settle for anything less than a just, sovereign, and irreversible peace. Surely that's very Australian. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador. It's a pleasure to be speaking to all of you here today at the National Press Club. Thank you for your interest. I acknowledge in particular the members of both the Press Gallery and the Parliamentary Friendship Group of Ukraine. Wonderful to see everyone here, as the Ambassador acknowledged in his speech. My name is Kateryna Argyrou. I'm here representing the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations. It's a peak body for 23 community organizations across all of Australia. My job here today is to be the voice of the community. As some of you may have noticed, I'm heavily pregnant, 8.5 months to be exact. Due to pregnancy complications, I actually shouldn't be here. I should be on bed rest. And the reason I'm not on bed rest and not in Sydney is because I have the opportunity to be the voice of those people that don't have a voice right now. And they would like to speak to you directly. Those are our Ukrainian community members, of which we are 55,000 strong here in Australia. Those are displaced Ukrainians that have arrived here because they have escaped Russian bombs and missiles, which there are 11,000 of here right now in Australia. 70% of them are women and children that have arrived on Australia's shores. And most importantly, I would like to be the voice of the men and women that are currently in the trenches on the Ukrainian front line, fighting tooth and nail for what we have here every day, freedom and democracy. Ukrainians desperately want to be heard. Since the beginning of this week, Stefan Romaniev and I, co-chairs of the AFUO, have been here since Monday. Yesterday, we were joined by another board member of ours, Christina Kmet, also in the audience. We were meeting with politicians at Parliament House advocating for Ukraine. Yesterday was a particularly tough day for me, not because of 12 hours of running up and down the halls of Parliament, but actually because of a documentary screening that was hosted by the Australia-Ukraine Parliamentary Friendship Group, which is chaired by Senator Bielik and Senator Reynolds, also here today. It was a documentary called Bullet Holes, and it told the story of Ukrainian children that were murdered by the Russian armed forces during the first weeks of the full-scale invasion. Not only was it incredibly difficult to hear the stories of innocent children being hunted down and killed, but I was particularly shaken by a story told by a pregnant woman that was captured by the Russian armed forces and was beaten by metal rods simply because she was Ukrainian, and then she was told that her baby did not deserve to live because that baby would be Ukrainian, and that that baby deserved to die, which is how the Russian armed forces approach Ukrainian citizens. And this is the reality of what's happening in Ukraine every single day right now. What we hear is statistics across headlines, but what we don't hear are the stories of children that are being raped and murdered on a daily basis in occupied territories because there's simply not enough media outlets to report that. It's too dangerous to be in those territories. But we do hear about maternity wards in hospitals being bombed. We see images of entire cities being razed to the ground and systematically being destroyed. My entire family is in Ukraine right now. I'm the only one here in Australia. My parents, grandparents, sisters, cousins, aunts, and uncles are all in Ukraine. They are being systematically hunted down by anything that flies, destroys, and kills. Ballistic missiles, hypersonic missiles, kamikaze drones. They can tell the difference of what is coming towards them by the sound that it makes. I don't want my sisters and my cousins to be at the risk of experiencing rape or being tortured. I don't want them to experience what the pregnant woman in the documentary last night experienced. I had 6 of my family members that were on the front line. I now have 2. The rest were injured. Luckily, they're still alive. They're in hospital recovering now. But I want them to survive. I want all of my family to survive. I want to see them again. This is why I and other members of the community spend every single waking minute doing everything we can to help Ukraine, because this war is deeply personal for us. Australian support for Ukraine, which is approaching $1 billion, has been significant. It has achieved a lot. It has helped us fight. It has helped us survive. Ukrainians here and Ukrainians in Ukraine are incredibly grateful, and we will never forget and will always remember how Australia stood up during Ukraine's darkest hour. But there is really a lot more that Australia can do. Over the past 2 years, Australia unfortunately has slipped from being the largest non-NATO contributor to Ukraine to being the 6th largest after Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria, and the Republic of Korea. Unfortunately, assistance packages have become smaller and less frequent. Yet in research that the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations has commissioned earlier this month, a significant majority of Australians, 82% to be exact, supported the federal government in providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine, increasing sanctions against Russia, and providing Australia's retired and unneeded military equipment to Ukraine. So that is one of my key messages here today. We're appealing to the Australian government to link its support to the scale of the challenge. If Ukraine is to end Russia's illegal and immoral war on its own terms, as ministers claim their goal is, Australia's support needs to be delivered at scale and at frequency that will help shift the dial. Stepping back, doing less, and doing it less often, as has been the trend recently, is not in Australia's national interest. Our community has come to Canberra this week with 4 main messages regarding how Australia can step up in 2024. 1 is to provide additional military support to Ukraine. 2, provide pathways to permanent residency for displaced Ukrainians in Australia. 3, reopen the Australian embassy in Kyiv. And 4, implement a whole-of-government approach to Ukraine. On the first point, military support is incredibly important. My background is in finance. I have been conditioned and taught about corporate social responsibility. And when I make investments, I look at environmental social governance factors. ESG is always at the top of our decision-making. And I would be the last person to advocate for weapons and military aid. But when my cousins are faced with tanks rolling down towards Kyiv and the only thing they have to protect them are Molotov cocktails that they just learned how to make, or when my family's on the front line and they have no ammunition to protect themselves with, and the only way they can survive and protect their families, their children, is if they have the weapons to fight back an aggressor that is absolutely ruthless, I become the #1 advocate for military aid for Ukraine. Not because I have nothing better to do, but because it's the only thing that will help keep my family alive. It's the only thing that the Ukrainians here that have been torn apart and have their husbands, family fighting on the front line, it's the only thing that gives them a chance to reunite at the end. So over 80% of Australia's contribution to Ukraine have been military related. And so I commend the government's decision this month to contribute $50 million to the International Fund for Ukraine, which delivers priority military equipment to Ukraine. As the very sad and unfortunate story of the Taipan helicopter showed us, there is a clear need for creative and proactive thinking about opportunities to support Ukraine. This hinges on two-way dialogue where both countries can have a better platform for collaboration. They can compare notes, make decisions quickly, and act at scale. What we have been advocating for as a community is for the Australian government to consider donating decommissioned equipment and to look at capabilities that will be phased out or that are surplus to ADF needs. Such things like M1 Abrams tanks, Aslavs, and potentially Tiger helicopters. We have also noticed that the ADF is auctioning off Unimogs, all-terrain vehicles, and boats on a site called Pickles. We would welcome the opportunity to discuss how those items could potentially be transferred to Ukraine because they would go an extremely long way in saving lives. I would also like to note that new money is also needed. From my last 2 years of work advocating for more military aid for Ukraine, it is evident that the biggest handbrake is hesitancy in the Department of Defense. Support for Ukraine comes out of the existing defense budget, which leads to reluctance in providing more military aid to Ukraine, and I understand that. So that's why, as a community, we are asking and hoping that the budget this year will include a line item for military support for Ukraine so the current hesitancy can come to an end. The second thing that our community has been advocating for is immigration and visas. Ukrainians who came here and escaped those Russian bombs and missiles were seeking safe haven and are increasingly asking about their future in this country. It is common for families to be on different visa categories, which gives them not only different levels of support, but also different lengths of stay. There is currently no identifiable pathway for them to secure permanent residency, which is causing major stress and anxiety. So we have been raising that this week with parliamentarians here in Canberra. The third is the reopening of the Australian Embassy in Kyiv. Australia is the only one of Ukraine's major partners in this fight which has not returned a diplomatic presence to the country. Over 80% of foreign missions which closed at the start of Russia's full-scale invasion have now been reopened for more than 6 months. The new Australian ambassador, and I met him before he left to go to Europe, is living in Poland and is yet to set foot in Ukraine after 3 months on the job. I remember him telling me that the reason he joined the diplomatic corps over 20 years ago is because he wanted to make a difference, and he desperately wants to be on the ground and to make a difference in Ukraine. To be in Ukraine right now is to understand the reality of war. A visit by the foreign minister to Ukraine to reopen the embassy would also send a very strong message of solidarity this year. This time last year, I watched Ambassador Myroshnychenko stand here on this stage and ask the government for a plan for how Australia could support Ukraine militarily. While that request has not been taken up, the breadth of Ukraine's needs for offensive capabilities, for defensive and protective technologies, for coal, for medevac channels, make coordination and strategy essential. Now is the time to establish the Ukraine Support Coordination Office within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, which would be focused on evaluating and prioritizing humanitarian, military, diplomatic, and legal opportunities for Australia to support Ukraine and Ukrainians. This would also be a channel through which private sector contributions to Ukraine can effectively be coordinated to enhance strategic impact and complement government contributions. These 4 asks, a whole-of-government approach, reopening the Australian Embassy in Kyiv, visa pathways to provide certainty for displaced Ukrainians, and meaningful and creative military support have been at the heart of the AFUO's conversations with ministers, shadow ministers, crossbenchers, and many others across Parliament this week. We look forward to continuing these discussions and seeing initiatives delivered. While this weekend marked 2 years since Russia's full-scale invasion, this month we also marked 10 years since Russia illegally occupied eastern Ukraine and annexed Crimea. This July will be 10 years since the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Missile Brigade, a unit of the Russian Armed Forces from Kursk in the Russian Federation, shot down 38 Australians flying on MH17. In the last decade, time has taken on new meaning for Ukrainians. Many feel they are living on borrowed time. For others, they long for a time without war. Political leaders here and around the world have been fond of saying that they are there with Ukraine for as long as it takes. 2 years in, this language of solidarity seems misplaced. We should not settle for a protracted, bloody stalemate, but instead we need partners who want to invest now to end this appalling invasion as quickly and efficiently as possible to help bring an end to the incredible human suffering. So it is time to be bold, to double down, to act quickly. Australia, please help us hold the line. Defending democracy isn't easy, fast or cheap, but it's the right thing to do. I want my soon-to-be-born son to enjoy a peaceful future where he can choose what subjects to study at school and what path to pursue in life. I don't want him to know or think about what weapon to pick up and what military mission to carry out, which is the reality for so many Ukrainians right now. Our community in Australia calls on the Australian government to be brave like Ukraine. Thank you for all your time, and Slava Ukraini.
Thank you very much, Kateryna. Look, I'll just ask one question before I move on to the journalists, and we have many journalists here today who want to ask questions. But Kateryna, you are in almost nightly conversations with people on the front line. We've seen what's happened in Avdiivka. Can you tell us what the situation is on the front line at the moment and what the soldiers there are asking you to provide?
Yes, thank you, Chris. What I didn't mention in my prepared remarks is that the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations has, over the past year, been fundraising for non-lethal military aid. We've raised over $1 million through the Defend Ukraine appeal, and the reason we established this is because we had so many of our community members reaching out to us and saying, I have a family member on the front line, whether it's a husband, brother, son, and they're in desperate need of something that doesn't cost much, but is incredibly critical. So the top 3 things that we get requests for are simple things like medevac vehicles, drones, surveillance drones, and walkie-talkies so they can communicate between each other. When we saw the things happen in Avdiivka, we had one of the commanders of the 47th Brigade reach out and say, look, we know that the 3rd Assault Brigade was asked to retreat from Avdiivka. So they were encircled and they were retreating. But the 47th Brigade was asked to stay there and to maintain their positions. The only thing they were asking for was help us get a medevac vehicle because we have our wounded soldiers here and we can't get them out quickly enough. They had 18 people there at the time and 6 of them were wounded. And for them, the only thing that mattered was speed and for someone to react to their request. So as a community, this is what we were able to do. We were able to fundraise for a medevac vehicle quickly, and we were able to get it to the front line quickly. Had they had better equipment, armored vehicles, maybe they wouldn't be in that situation. Maybe they would be able to evacuate quickly and have less losses. But this is what we hear from the front line on a daily basis, is that speed and delivery really matters, because if they're in a difficult situation, they can't wait for months, 6 months, 12 months for the aid to arrive, and every little bit makes a difference. So if we can do something like providing medevac vehicles or providing drones that they could see where the enemy is coming from at a small scale, and we're raising literally dollar by dollar, then imagine the impact that a government can have that can provide hundreds of millions of dollars of aid and really shift the dial and help these boys get out of the positions that they are in, or help bring an end to this war and suffering a lot faster.
Our first question is from the ABC.
Andrew Green from the ABC. Dobry den, Kateryna and Ambassador. We've heard you in your speech identify the reluctance on a number of occasions to donate things like Hawkeyes and Taipans. I think you identified that correctly that a lot of these donations come from the existing defence budget. Can I ask you perhaps what your message is to the Defence Department, which seems to be behind a lot of this reluctance, particularly the Army? What is your message to them when they say that some of this equipment is not appropriate for Ukraine or can't be used? Do you think that there needs to be more discussion with the military in Australia?
My first response, thank you for the question, Andrew. My first response is that we are incredibly grateful for everything that the ADF has provided. I know it's not an easy process. I know that there's a lot of discussions and analysis that stands behind it. And one of the things that really stood out for me was when some of our Australian troops were going to train the Ukrainian troops, and we had a chance to speak to them over Zoom when they were leaving from South Australia. It was incredibly emotional because I could see how proud our Australian troops were that they were going and contributing and that they were training Ukrainians, and it was really a touching moment, and I could see how much care there was. From a community perspective, when we ask for decommissioned equipment or anything else, it is incredibly disappointing when we just get no's, and for different reasons, because I know that there's a different level of risk assessment. I know that there are problems with or potentially considerations with transport, how much that would cost. Lots of different things go into the decision-making process, but we as a community, we're happy to step in. If transport's an issue, we'll crowdfund. We'll find a way. If it's a risk assessment issue, please let Ukraine make that risk assessment. They're the ones on the front line. They're the ones that can say whether they can use a certain type of equipment or not. Decisions being made by someone that's not in a war situation, it's very different to someone that desperately needs something on the front line. So if I would distill my message, it's to please consider those requests because they are desperately needed and they literally go towards saving lives. And if Ukraine can make the risk assessment, that would be very welcome.
And welcome back, Chris, so hopefully you'll let me have a follow-up. Ambassador.
I'm going to come down like a tingle hammer in a moment. Yeah, go. It's your colleagues you need to worry about. Go on.
On the Abrams tank specifically, would that be something you're now seeking, Ambassador?
I would like to confirm that there is an interest in this capability, and I, of course, will welcome the discussions with the defence on this. And currently, we've had the coalition of a tank coalition of different countries who have contributed to this, and if of course it's up to the government to decide if that could be provided. But definitely we would be interested in this, moving forward. We need to build the capability to be able to defend Ukraine and to be able to build up even the deterrent for the future, whatever is going to come after that. So,
next question is from the Australian Financial Review.
Andrew Tillett from the Fin and also a board member here at the Press Club. Ambassador, you spoke, and both Kateryna spoke, about the danger of the war becoming a stalemate, a meat grinder. If you do not get the military aid that you need from the West, what is Ukraine's fate? And the question then surely should be, are peace talks an avenue to try and end this fighting, given if the West leaves you alone?
That's a very good question. And every time we talk about peace negotiations with Russia, Russia talks about Ukraine's surrender. And when Moscow talks about peace talks, it's usually peace under the occupation. So at this stage, the only tangible plan that we have is Ukraine's peace formula. And it's a 10-point plan, which was announced by President Zelensky about 1.5 years ago. And it doesn't only include the ending of the hostilities, but also it includes 10 other important points, such as energy security, nuclear safety, environmental protection, human rights, restoring respect to the UN Charter, accountability, and other very important items. And during this past year, we have worked on creating a coalition of countries which are working on the implementation of this peace formula. We're very pleased to have Australia on board for this. Currently, we are working with the Swiss government on holding a peace formula summit. And at the end of the day, whatever the findings and the work of that majority of the world, last time we already had 88 countries participating in the meeting of the national security advisors and foreign policy advisors, which just took place in January in Davos. We will offer Russia that basically from that position of the majority of the world, a plan of how this war can end. And we all understand that at the end of the day, there will be negotiations. But at this time, this is the only plan that we have. But of course, Ukrainians will keep on fighting. We understand that's an existential war. We are fighting for our existence, and Russians are not stopping. And we see how different countries are stepping up, and that gives us that confidence that we will prevail. Of course, we understand it's not going to be an easy one. We see what's happening on the defense line. We don't expect much of a huge change this year, but at this stage, our strategy is to build on defensive defense, active defense, where we can inflict maximum damage to the enemy and hold territory out there. But of course, it becomes very difficult once you run out of ammunition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The Australian.
Hello, Rhiannon Down from The Australian. Thank you for your speech. Ambassador, US President Joe Biden has ruled out providing military troops to assist in the Ukrainian war effort. Would you encourage Ukraine's allies, including Australia, to provide troops, or is aid and military hardware enough?
Troops and boots on the ground are not on the table. It's not been discussed. All we need, we have the people, we have the manpower, and it usually is three factors which define the outcome of the war. It's manpower, money, and materiel. We get the manpower. We will keep on fighting. We need the military assistance and military aid, and of course, big elephant in the room. And there might be a question on the U.S. support. We are hoping for that support to come. It's in the strategic interests of the U.S. Of the U.S. government to make sure that we can defend ourselves and we can win in this war. And we hope that whatever hurdles that are currently in Washington, they will be overcome. And because American leadership in this case is crucial, and we are very thankful to President Biden, his administration, bipartisan support of both parties in the Congress, and of course American people for that support coming. We'll work with any president that will be out there. It doesn't matter. It's a choice for American people. But it's definitely in the interests of America and the free world, making sure that we can stop the aggressor, we can stop the dictator who is so delusional in his fight trying to change borders by force. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and it would be much easier to just say 9 newspapers, David Crowe.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, by the way, for your documentary on Ukraine, Fortune Fire. But I'm from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age of Melbourne, proudly. Kateryna, this is mainly a question for you because it's about humanitarian aid. Australians have contributed significantly to humanitarian aid to Ukraine. The Press Gallery up in Parliament House contributed $100,000 through the Midwinter Ball funds. So that contribution has been happening from Australia, but I would like your opinion of whether Ukraine fatigue is kicking in and whether there are any danger signs for that humanitarian aid. And also, I think for viewers at home, what is it that Ukraine needs most from Australian citizens? We've heard about what Ukraine would like from the Australian government, but from Australian citizens, what's the humanitarian aid that can help the most?
Thank you for your question. So to give you an overview of what we have done here in Australia with the support of a lot of Australian citizens is that from a community effort perspective, the Australian Federation of Ukrainian Organizations runs the Ukraine Crisis Appeal, which that $100,000 was donated to. We have managed to raise close to $10 million in that fund. The AFUO has also established Future Ukraine, which has raised $5 million, and there's the United Ukraine Appeal, which has raised another $5 million. So all up, from a community effort, we know that there has been close to $20 million that has been raised in humanitarian aid from everyday Australians. That is an incredible amount of support. It has gone towards funding shelters that are mainly for displaced women and children from those areas close to the front line. It has gone towards disaster relief, medical aid, actually medevac vehicles that transport these people from the east of the country to either Kiev or to the west. So there has been an incredible amount of support coming from Australia. What we have noticed over recent times is that donations have slowed. Ukraine is no longer a headline in the news. We have had some press coverage recently because of the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion, but I'm personally afraid that Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine will be the forgotten war. The human suffering has only increased since the beginning of the year. Russia has only increased their missile and kamikaze drone attacks on every part of Ukraine, not just targeted cities. So the human suffering has only gone through the roof, while the aid has unfortunately slowed due to Ukraine not having such a prominent position in global news. So that's why, as community, it's so important for us to advocate with government to continue that aid, to have Ukraine somewhere on the map, to have Ukraine as a talking point and as a priority, because we can't afford to forget about it. Otherwise, the people that are currently suffering will suffer even more. There's a lot of need for not only shelters right now and humanitarian medical aid, but to rebuild some of those areas that have been destroyed. With the embassy, we have worked with United 24, President Zelensky's platform, to rebuild a school in eastern Ukraine that was destroyed by a Russian missile attack. We're working on funding 2 rehabilitation centers that provide prosthetics for people that have been, for civilians that have been impacted by all of these missile strikes and are living without limbs right now. So the need is only increasing, and that's why any support from Australia is very much appreciated and goes a long way.
Thank you. The Nine Network.
Kateryna, Ambassador, Andrew Probman. I'm from David Crow's mothership, the Nine Network. Now, you talked about, and we've heard today about defence reluctance, but let me ask you about other reluctance when it comes to Ukraine requests. Ambassador, you requested Australia give Ukraine some coal back in December. There appears to be some reluctance to that. In fact, I don't think you've heard a response. Whitehaven Coal says that if called upon once again by an Australian government to make a shipment of coal available to support energy security for the people of Ukraine, we would look upon that request favourably. Does it worry you both that that request hasn't even been passed on to the company that last gave something like 70,000 tonnes in 2022?
Well, we would be very grateful for consideration of the government on this request. We have an all-year-round need and for coal, which is part of our energy security. Russians have taken over all our supplies of coal within the country, and definitely this is not our lifestyle choice that we have. It's a matter of making sure that people have electricity all year round, people have heating during the winter season, and also that the contribution that was made in 2022 was so strong and so meaningful to help us go through that year, and we would definitely be very grateful for that consideration. And
Kateryna, would you like to direct your answer to the Deputy Prime Minister when it comes to coal?
First of all, I would like to thank Minister Marles for the support that he's provided. He recently attended a community meeting in Geelong, where he also signed a drone for us by the Defend Ukraine appeal that was delivered to the front line in Bakhmut, to the 80th Assault Brigade that actually drives all of the Bushmasters from Australia. We have recorded a message for you. The boys actually have. We will get that over to you today. So deeply grateful for all the support you've provided. I understand you and the Australian government's being pulled in a million directions. You have priority areas that you look at, but just would like to, from our community to the government, to reach out to consider Ukrainian requests, because they are desperately needed, and if a whole-of-government approach is something that you would be willing to consider, maybe that would help with the process of coordinating these different questions, because I know you're getting bombarded with humanitarian questions and military questions and coal and a whole bunch of other reasons that we need to tug at government for. But if we can formalize somehow this whole of government approach, have someone sitting in the PM's office looking at what's the best way to approach the strategy, what's the most efficient way to provide the support to Ukraine. Perhaps that would unlock some of these requests faster and provide answers faster. This we can do, this we can't, sorry. And it would help us in our community advocacy as well, and I'm sure it would help the ambassador with the request that he's getting bombarded. But yeah, first of all, thank you for everything that you have done, and we hope to continue to work with you.
Thank you. The SBS.
Thank you, Sarah Tomevska from SBS. I just want to throw forward to the upcoming NATO summit in Washington this July. Jens Stoltenberg's predecessor has said that this idea of waiting until the war is over is quite dangerous, as it could incentivise Russia to continue hostilities for the foreseeable future. Do you have any hope that the US and Germany could shift its position on this, or do you think we'll just see a repeat of open door promises into the future and no real action?
You know, when looking at what has happened during the past 2 years, we now fully understand and realize that for Putin it was never about NATO expansion. It was never about protecting Russian-speaking people. It was always about this imperialistic conquest of land, of annihilating an independent nation and changing borders in Europe and undermining global security. So we all in Ukraine realize that for us to have any safe future, that NATO is the only option in itself. And the declaration that was approved at the Vilnius summit, the declaration in support of Ukraine, is one step forward. As a result of the declaration, we have been signing bilateral agreements, bilateral security agreements with a number of countries, which started off with the UK, and then we had Germany and France, which also we signed similar agreements, and now more recently with Canada and Denmark. And also other countries. And we hope that this will be kind of a first step towards eventual NATO membership, because as we've seen, as a sovereign country, we have totally our foreign policy choice. And what Russians have done, we see how the whole paradigm shift in Europe. Two neutral countries like Finland and Sweden have joined NATO now. I mean, Sweden is just completing some formalities now. They've just overcome the ratification in the Hungarian parliament. But the reason they've done it, because they've seen what Russia has done in Ukraine. And that's clearly, and now that the border is all changing for us, for the future, for investors who will come to rebuild the country, that's the only guarantee. We don't know what's going to be the outcome of the summit in the U.S., of the NATO summit, but we remain optimistic that eventually it will happen and we'll become NATO members. Thank you.
Asia Pacific Defence Reporter.
Thank you, Kim Bergman from Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. When I hear Australian defence officials speak, particularly from Army, they seem to have a view of Ukraine that it's somehow some sort of medieval economy with serfs in the fields pulling ploughs by hand. I'm not sure if any of them have ever actually visited Ukraine, but I was wondering if you could use the opportunity to explain Ukraine's level of technological development and your ability to operate and support modern weapons systems.
Thank you. It's a very good question. And I think even during the past several weeks, we already see we've been able to down 10 Russian fighter jets, of course, having the capabilities that were provided by the Western countries, sunk a big ship in the Black Sea. And also, we've seen how we were able to operate and deploy drones in this war. And I think a lot of this is a telling example of the technological expertise, but also the talent that we have within the country. Ukraine currently has software industry in itself, and technological industry is a big part of our economy. At least 5% of our exports are coming from that sector. We have 300,000 software development engineers in Ukraine. Many of them actually are working with prominent Australian companies, and they know them, such as Canva, Atlassian, Aristocrat. This is a publicly listed company who continue employing Ukrainian talent out there. So we see it in the private sector. We see it now how a lot of the talent was transferred to the military and how that's been used out there. And in a way, it all comes down, from historical reasons of having that, high advanced engineering degrees in education, which, have technically have transferred to the modern days, and we've been able to capitalize on that. And definitely we would welcome the visit of Deputy Prime Minister should he decide to come to Ukraine to visit Ukraine. I think that would be, I know that he's interested in doing that. He told me that a long time ago, and we hope that there will be an opportunity to come and visit the country.
Thank you.
Maybe if I could also add one thing to that. So in our work through community, through the Defend Ukraine appeal, we've established relationships with over 50 different brigades across the entire front line in Ukraine, starting from Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson regions. The types of requests that we receive them in real time. So if the troops see something changing on the front line, that is what they request. Can you help us with this? So we've seen an enormous shift in electronic warfare, how drones are used, what types of drones are being requested, what type of anti-drone guns are being requested, signal jammers, and that is moving at lightning speed. I think Australia has a very unique capability where they produce a lot of that. The Australian government has provided aid in the form of anti-drone guns and drones as well. So I think that there's an opportunity for information and intelligence exchange there as well, because the speed at which things change on the front line could really benefit Australia in learning that and to advance industry here and to implement the changes here. So I think that's one thing that can come out of it. And looking at what Ukraine is up against the second largest army in the world and how they've been able to hold off and maintain the positions that they have with the limited resources that they have, being outgunned, outnumbered, I think speaks for itself how innovative the troops on the front line have been. And you also need to think about that these are not just regular troops that have been trained textbook material. This is how you conduct a mission. This is how you do an operation. These are everyday Ukrainians that are teachers, IT specialists, businessmen. They come with different skills and different ways of looking at things. And the number one thing that they try to do while they're on the front line is figure out how to survive. So there's a lot of innovation that goes on there. And trust me, with the limited materials and things that they have been very innovative. And I think it would benefit Australia to learn from that.
Bloomberg.
Ben Westcott from Bloomberg. Thank you very much for your speech today. We recently saw the EU approve a $15 billion grant to Ukraine, and that stands in stark contrast to what we've seen out of the US, where the aid package there is currently stalled. If that remains stalled through the political instability in the US, is there any chance that Ukraine can survive on European support alone? And just on the EU, what's your reaction to comments from President Macron on potential boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Currently, EU is as a bloc of nations is the largest supporter of Ukraine. I mean, it's EU plus EU member states now contributed overall 88 billion euro since the start of the war, plus this new facility for the next 4 years. Nevertheless, American support and contribution is crucial. I mean, it will be very difficult to sustain and keep up without that coming. Of course, we will continue and we will carry on no matter what. But American support is very significant, and we hope that it will come. We remain positive and optimistic that it will be unlocked. In terms of some of the recent comments and discussions, I believe it's good that they are coming. I mean, as we know, it was a private meeting, and I don't think that it's still on the table. We've seen the reaction from other leaders, but at the end of the day, if every time we withdraw from a new city in Ukraine, the Russian troops come closer to the EU, and it's real, and it's out there. If those of us many who didn't believe that Russia would ever invade Ukraine at such a scale, they should remember that Russia will one day come and want to test NATO, and I think it's very real and it can happen. So it's important that we can stop it now in Ukraine and prevent from a bigger war from happening in Europe, and also to prevent a chain reaction of other interstate wars around the world, because whatever dealing with a crisis afterwards will be of a much higher cost. So the idea is just let's get it done now, and just it's going to be much cheaper than wait until whatever is going to happen, how other leaders will be emboldened to do it. We already see this cooperation between Russia, North Korea, and Iran. We see how it is developing. North Korea is sending lots of 152mm ammunition. We also have seen some long-range missiles that they've been sending, all the Iranian drones. So we'll see how it's all changing, and how the world is changing, and how it is emboldening other dictators to go and use force against smaller nations.
Thanks very much.
AOP.
Thank you both very much for your time today. Ambassador, you outlined how Ukraine doesn't have enough helicopters, and as you know, the federal government chose to dismantle and bury the Taipans. It said that that option was the best for Australian taxpayer money. What is your response to that? And would Ukraine still be willing or still want to take whatever is left of the Taipan choppers?
I provided these comments before. I think it was a missed opportunity, and should there be any surplus of airborne equipment, we'll be very happy to negotiate and talk to the government about these opportunities. And of course, that's my answer. Yeah.
Capital Brief.
Finn McHugh at Capital Brief. Thank you both for your time. We have a presidential election in the US coming up that may not just see the return of Donald Trump, but a whole host of Republicans that have been very vocal in their calls to cut funding to your country. I know you said that you're prepared to work with any US president, but how much more difficult would it be to work with a Trump administration?
Generally, we enjoy bipartisan support in America. I mean, if you look at the majority of the Republican Party, they're very supportive of Ukraine. Also, I would like to remind that when President Trump was the president first time, that was when Ukraine got javelins, anti-tank missiles. Also, U.S. provided some petrol boats, imposed sanctions on the Nord Stream 2, and also supported Crimea Declaration, which is a very important political statement recognizing Crimea as part of Ukraine. And it all happened under his administration. So, of course, we'll see how it goes. So we'll work with any president. It's a choice for American people to make. And it's not, supporting Ukraine is not in any party interest. It is in the national interest of America. And we'll hope that it will stay that way. Thank you.
The Mandarin.
Hello, thank you for your talk. Melissa Code from the Mandarin. This week, the Lowy Institute published its Global Diplomacy Index. The last index was published about 4 years ago, and Russia dropped 2 places in that index, representing fewer diplomatic posts around the world, but its network still is quite extensive. And Ambassador, I'd like to ask you, called for Australia to remain an enthusiastic member of liberal democracy, a group. What does that represent when it comes to Russia, if its intention is just to have this imperialistic conquest of land? Why would it pay attention to anyone who is a staunch supporter of liberal democracy?
You see, what's happening in Russia, I mean, Russia has, during the past 24 years, it have turned into a total dictatorship. They just kill political dissidents, the recent assassination of Alexei Navalny. But that's not the first one, not the last one. They've done many of those. They've done it in different other countries. And the country is really, what Putin has done to Russia, he made Russia toxic. And the way the system has changed, there is no prospect for the Russian people. And I hope that there will be a time when it will change, and Russians will strive for democracy, and they will strive to change it. We don't know when it's going to happen, but at the end of the day, because for us, we'll have Russia always next door to us. And in one case, we need to have strong economy, strong military to deter any future aggressions, but we'll be much better off if Russia changed. Under these circumstances, it's very difficult. We still have majority of Russians supporting the invasion of Ukraine. They support Putin. He feels very strong. He feels very emboldened about what he's been doing, and that's very unfortunate. And of course, we see how it all changed, and we've realized that Russia, which for a long time there was an impression that Russia wants to be one of those democracies, that Russia wants to change, but it all has reversed when Putin became a president, and his fascination with this change in borders. I mean, his recent interview is one of the telling examples of going deep into the history of seeing whatever Russian empire was, that he has any right to claim that any lands which ever belonged to Russia. I mean, how bizarre it is in the 24th century.
Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And Nick, fast game's a good game. Ability News.
Thank you for your powerful speeches, because they've been a reminder that the legacy of this war is going to be disability. Thousands of people are going to be maimed, not in terms of capacity, because of expertise, because I know Ukraine has expertise in dealing with disability, but in terms of capacity. Could Australia provide medical and other assistance to you with working on rehabilitation and other means like this in the future?
Absolutely, and here I would like to thank Australian government for supporting a group of Ukrainian psychologists and psychiatrists who are recently here on a DFAT fellowship, and they came to Australia and spent 3 months here on a fellowship learning about how to better provide services to those people who have mental health issues caused by trauma. And that was one step, one of the examples of what could be done. Of course, dealing with trauma in the future will be one of the generational issue for us, because we even now estimate that there are at least 300,000 people with disabilities, both civilians and military. And the way those people were affected by war, you know, as well as the entire population of Ukraine. And that could be one of those contributions. For instance, there are also some innovative companies in Australia. One of those, a company in Melbourne called Polynova, they are producing these products which are helping to heal wounds and recreate skin after severe burns. They made some donations, for instance, to help Ukraine, but there is always a room of how the government, but also the community and generally Australia could contribute in sending some of those.
We're up against the tyranny of time, and the ABC must move on to other programming. Alas, we could be here all day. I'd like to thank the members of the press for being here today. I'd like to thank you both for being here today. We have 2 invaluable memberships of the National Press Club for next time you are in Canberra. And by the way, for those that don't know how Canberra works, today is a sitting day. It's a big deal that ministers and shadow ministers and members of parliament made time to take 2 hours out of their day and to be here today. So can you please thank our guests and thank them.